Hello and welcome to this video for Fortune and Freedom. I'm joined today by far right-wing author and racist comedian, Jewish Nazi, debate fetishist, immigrant job thief, and of course, worst of all, Russian mansplainer, Konstantin Kisin. Konstantin, what are your pronouns?
WTFFFS is always what the pronouns that I use. But yes, thank you for that generous introduction.
You're legendary, but you're even more legendary now because you've written a book called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. Here's a copy of it so everyone can see what it looks like. At least that's what my copy looks like. The best part of this book,
people a proper copy, right? This is what it actually looks like. This is what you want to buy.
It is a bit more flashy with the red. Everyone loves red. Let's move to the most interesting part of the book, which is the manifesto at the end. It's called 10 Ways to Destroy the West. It's obviously tongue-in-cheek, as was my introduction. But I want to ask you why you wrote it that way.
Well, I wanted to point out, first of all, that quite a lot of what we're currently doing in the West aligns pretty neatly with those 10 bullet points that I made. And particularly the last point is the one that I think always as the most important one. That's why I chose to end the book on it, which is that if you go along with things that you don't believe to be comfortable or to be safe or to be protected from criticism or whatever, that is actually how most of the evil throughout history has been done. So going along with things that you don't agree with or you think are really deeply wrong, just because you don't want to be heard is not a good idea. And worse, the other part of it that I talk about as well is that people will be willing to do quite a lot of damage even to their own society if they believe in an ideology. And ideology is a very powerful tool. So it concerns me that we have a small minority, but they're a vocal minority of people in the West who've bought into ideologies that are fundamentally destructive to our society and are against what we stand for and the basis of why we are prosperous and successful and stable as we are in the West. So I just wanted to kind of point out that I do feel somewhat critical of myself in regard to the book because I feel like we've all spent a lot of time being negative about stuff. And I wrote a book called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West, in which you're right, I do spend quite a bit of time talking about what's wrong with the West's current direction. But that is because I believe in the West. I think the West's values are good values, and I don't want us to throw them away. So I wanted to write the book to encourage people to think about, well, what actually are British values in my case, or Western values more broadly, and not to shy away from the fact that such a thing even exists, which a lot of people nowadays do.
Yeah, the reason the book works so well is because that contrast and your experience and your background, which we'll get to. But first, I still want to mention the fact that the way you've answered that question is as if this is just happening to the West or we're just doing it to ourselves. But there's also a school of thought that this is sort of deliberate and a bit more nefarious. And there was a fantastic part of the book which talked about Yuri Bezmenov, who came up or who revealed the fact that, you take it away.
Well, Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB defector in the 70s and 80s whose book title I've sort of stolen because he wrote a book called A Love Letter to America. And I adapted it, and the message is not dissimilar, of course. But Yuri Bezmenov suggested that the Soviet Union was spending a lot of its resources and money and influence and power actually not to steal Western military secrets, although it was, of course, doing that as well, but mainly to demoralize and destabilize Western societies and to take them away from the things that make them healthy and strong. Now, I am personally not someone who thinks that this is all a coordinated plot by whoever. Everyone's got their favorite villain. It's the CCP, or it's the Putin, or it's Klaus Schwab, whatever. People have all these crazy things that I just don't believe in. But what I do think, and this is something Bezmenov mentioned himself in his lectures, was that you cannot demoralize or subvert a society that does not want to be demoralized. And so while, of course, China and Russia spend a lot of time and a lot of money attempting to influence what we see on our social media so that we get the wrong impression of what's actually happening in the world or what our fellow citizens believe, in truth, in my opinion, is if we had a much healthier immune system, then none of this would matter. It's kind of like a mind virus is exactly like a virus. If you've got a strong immune system, it doesn't really matter that you've been exposed necessarily. And I think that's what this is really about. One of the things that strikes me as very odd is we don't. It's actually kind of really racist in a way, the way we think about things in the West, because we don't apply our own standards to other people. So, for example, right now here in the UK, we have Rishi Sunak, who's of Indian descent. He's been elected prime minister, or he's been appointed actually prime minister, you could say. And prior to that, we had a very diverse ethnically cabinet. And the conversation we were having in this country is, well, are these people truly minorities if they've got the wrong opinions, right? When the CCP has a meeting of the Politburo and appoints an exclusively male, exclusively Han Chinese, exclusively people over 65 Politburo, no one says anything. When China has the temerity to go to the UN and criticize America for its racism over the death of George Floyd, while putting millions of people in camps because of their ethnicity and their religion, this is not met with incredulous laughter. This is actually taken seriously. When Vladimir Putin claims that he is denazifying Ukraine, while Dmitry Rogozin, who is an open nationalist fascist in Russia, was his appointee as NATO ambassador, later deputy prime minister, and now he heads Russia's equivalent of NASA, right? No one laughs when he says all of this. So we do not apply the same standards to other people as we do to ourselves. And as a result of that, we have this ridiculous idea that we're somehow the worst people who've ever lived. I don't believe that. I have a different perspective on that because I wasn't born here and I'm not imbued with the various types of guilt that people are supposed to have if they're decent, progressive, moral people in Britain. I just, I come from another place. I have some perspectives that are different because of that. I also try to read history, which I think helps. If you don't read history, you can't really understand what's going on. And so that's, I think that's where we're coming from. But no, I don't think this is a coordinated attempt to subvert the West. I think this is the West getting very comfortable with itself, too prosperous, too stable, too comfortable for too long. And we've sort of started to take it all for granted. And that's why I hope an immigrant like me can come in and go, actually, it's not quite as bad as you're being told. And in fact, here are some inconvenient hate facts about reality.
You've made the mistake of falling prey to your own criticism there. There's the first point for the 10 ways to destroy the West is see everything in terms of race always. And you have lots of good examples of this. I don't know which one's your favorite, perhaps that the segregation that's breaking out of lots of places in the US, or there's lots of examples of the race lens.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I talk about is my experience as a first generation immigrant in the UK, where I actually, when I was applying for what we call indefinite leave to remain, which is permission to stay in the country for as long as you want, basically, the precursor to getting British nationality. When my wife and I applied for that, we had to deal with a very rude person at the processing office. And later, when we made an application online or by post, as it was then, we had a letter back saying we have 2 weeks to leave the country, which was completely baseless. That somebody at the Home Office had made a mistake. And I think inevitably, if I was a 20-year-old, activist in the current climate, I think I would immediately conclude that this was xenophobia and racism and whatever. But as it happened, I wasn't really afforded that luxury because the people who were rude and the people who'd make the mistakes were both of foreign descent themselves, right? So I was not afforded that opportunity. And that's when you can go, well, actually, this is probably just overworked civil servants making mistakes. Or in the case of the woman who was very rude, she actually was off work with stress. And the next time we came back to make the application. So this is individual human dynamics. People can be absolute twats, whatever their skin color. And I think that's really important to remember. And you're right. Yeah, if we see everything through the lens of race, particularly in societies like ours, which actually aspire towards equality. This is what people don't understand. Most of the rest of the world has absolutely no aspiration towards treating people of different ethnicities equally. Most other countries operate on the basis that there's a dominant ethnic group, and that ethnic group enforces its will on the minorities, and the minorities are treated like minorities. We aspire towards treating people equally. And in multi-ethnic societies like Britain, like Australia, like the United States, the only way you can really hold them together coherently is if you follow Martin Luther King's advice and you aim for a race blind, color blind society. We never got there, and it's a very hard thing to achieve, but that should be the aspiration. And the further we move away from that, I think the more likely it is that we put into place the foundations for some very nasty things down the line.
But there's a huge irony in the fact that what people who see the world through these racist colored glasses, they end up sort of advocating the very same policies that were imposed on them under genuinely racist governments or societies.
Well, right, and they never think about this. So Ibram Kendi, for example, this great god of progressivism, he says that the answer to past discrimination is present discrimination, and he doesn't seem to think the next step, which is what is going to be the answer to present discrimination. If discrimination is bad, and the answer to discrimination is in the past is to discriminate against people in the present, what do you think the people who are being discriminated against now are going to do in the future? And they never seem to think about this. And this seems to me to be quite a profound point. As I say, I think thinking in this way lays the foundations for quite a lot of tensions in the future that we start to see breaking out in the UK over things like grooming gangs, etc. If we start to judge people not on the content of their character, but we start to go, oh, this person is of this ethnicity, that means we got to be extra sensitive when they commit mass murder or mass rape or whatever. Like, I don't think that's a healthy route to go down. And I say this as a dark-skinned first-generation immigrant. I don't want to live in a society where people look at me and they go, oh, he's a whatever, we must think like this, because once you open that door, you have no idea who's going to walk through it.
Yeah, I grew up going to international schools around Europe, and for me, racism has always just been sort of laughable, something you actually could joke about because it was so absurd because of the environment I was in, and nobody was actually racist. So I've never quite understood this, and I've only experienced the version that you write about so well, which is that it's positive discrimination, which is even more bizarre to me then.
Now, we should be clear. I mean, racism, there are people who are racist. I talk about people being racist to me in the book. There is a minority of low IQ, unsuccessful people who don't have a good place in life, who are miserable, who are sad, who've not been brought up well, who've not been well educated, who will have racist views. And that will be the case no matter how many hashtags we put on Twitter or how many times we kneel to BLM or whatever. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. It's a tiny minority in all our countries. And that's how it should stay. And my concern is that we continue to tell people that they're racist because they have the wrong opinion as opposed to because they're racist. Then eventually you get to a point where people are going to go, well, you know what? F that. Well, maybe I am racist. And that's the path that I really don't want us to go down.
Yeah. My wife's Japanese, and in Japan, people are quite racist. It's quite a racist society. They really want to maintain their homogeneity. And one of the things that makes me laugh is that they see a lot of the problems that you highlight in the book in the West as being a consequence of attempting a multiracial society. This is more of a tough one for you. What do you think of that?
Well, what I think of that is to some extent they're wrong and to some extent they're right. It is easier from a social cohesion point of view to have a society where everyone comes from the same ethnic group. That does not mean that it's better. And I don't think that it is better, because even from an evolutionary perspective, there's something called hybrid vigor, which is children of people from different ethnic groups tend to have stronger survival, etc. So you've got different things. And on a societal level, I think a moderate level of carefully selected immigration, where you pick the people who come in from different places, allows you to maintain vibrancy and dynamism in a society that otherwise might become a bit stagnant. So I think it's easier to maintain ethnic cohesion. Doesn't necessarily mean it's better. What I do think, though, is that if you are going to have multi-ethnic societies like the ones that we live in, then we have to be extra vigilant not to think in racist ways. And one of the most racist ways that you can think is go, oh, this person's skin color is this, that means that about them, right? Instead of just going, we're all individuals, we all got our own views and our own values. That is the basis on which we evaluate each other. And of course, most importantly, on our behavior. If you behave well, it doesn't matter what your skin color is. And if you behave badly, it doesn't matter what your skin color is. If you're a victim of crime, it doesn't matter what your skin color is. And if you're a criminal, it does not matter what your skin color is. We should treat people on that basis. Otherwise, you're building up the very tensions that the Japanese are concerned about.
I think Japanese people would say that we don't even know how to behave well because we're foreigners. But let's move on.
Well, I don't disagree with you, by the way. I've been to Japan, and I just felt like a complete barbarian there. Like the way I speak is really harsh. The way I think is really unnuanced. The way I behave is really rude and offensive and inconsiderate. It's an amazing place, Japan.
But you know what? They would appreciate and understand your comedy and the position that you've taken with your political incorrect. With being willing to be politically incorrect. I think because they have that homogeneity, they're a lot less insecure about being ridiculed and having that sort of view. Maybe not from a foreigner, but anyway. Number 2 in this 10 ways to destroy the West is sort of the same idea, but self-hatred. The idea of it's new. It's not just about racism or all these causes. It's you actually have to actively hate yourself for being a white male or whatever combination it is. And this has gone to completely bizarre lengths, especially in the perception of history, where you write really well about it doesn't really matter who did what in history. It's a question of whether they were a Westerner or not.
Well, right. And so when I talk about self-hatred, I'm not even talking about white men or anything like that. I'm just talking about the West in general. There is a feeling in the West, and you see it reflected, for example, in some of the green activism. And this, this isn't a point about, climate change or any of that. It's just a point about how people think about the West. Here in the UK, we are determined to punish ourselves with poverty and insecurity by not producing our own energy, because deep down, this activism isn't really about saving the planet, because we know the UK produces 1% of global emissions, or our carbon footprint is 2%. There's nothing we can do. There is literally nothing the UK can do to stop climate change, other than inventing technology that will solve that problem. But we spend an awful lot of time, we've got people gluing themselves to roads and throwing soup at paintings. And I think that's really not about the climate issue at all. What this green ideology is, some elements of it, is a sort of self-flagellation. We have this body of Western guilt. We've been too powerful and too successful and too colonial for too long. And now it is time to punish ourselves. We must reduce that's why they focus so much on getting people to stop consuming. When we know, as I say, for a fact, that even if Britain was to disappear into the depths of the ocean tomorrow, it would make not one jot of difference to the issue of the climate. But they are absolutely obsessed with getting us to reduce consumption. And I think that's because it's a fundamentally anti-human way of looking at the world. And it's emerged in the West because I think of this, this feeling like, why are we so privileged? Because we truly are. The West is truly privileged. We are richer and more comfortable and healthier than most of the rest of the world. We live longer, etc. And I think this deep, first you take it for granted, and then you start to, it's introspection. It's like a form of cabin fever almost, because I don't really see this going on with people who've traveled a lot around the world, because once you do, these ideas become impossible to hold. Likewise with many ideas. Now, we talked before we started about, being dads. Quite a lot of some of the ideas that I satirize and mock in the book, they are very easy to hold as long as you don't have any connection to reality. But once you have a child or children and you're forced to look after them, like reality smacks you in the face every single day. And pretending that there's no difference between boys and girls or any of that, it doesn't wash. Right. So we've got quite a lot of people, I think, who've never really been taught history properly, who've never traveled outside, going on a beach holiday to a Western European country, which is quite similar to theirs, really. They've never really socialized with people who don't think like them, which is most of the rest of the world, by the way. They haven't been to Russia and they haven't seen how Russians think about things, or how the Chinese think about things, or the Japanese. Um, and so we've got a very naive way of looking at it. And in that situation, if you've got nothing to compare your situation to, well, you look around and you go, well, we are rich, we are comfortable. Isn't that unfair? Shouldn't we, and I think that's where a lot of people seem to have forgotten that. I mean, at the end of the day, geopolitics is a team game. It's a tribal competition. We are trying to do better than other people. We're trying to do the best we can for our citizens, being good, being successful, being effective, winning. These are all good things for us and our children and our grandchildren. But, if you live with your cats and have pink hair and no children, that way of looking is perhaps more appealing.
Step 3 in destroying the West is everything in life is political. And the part of this I want to focus on is your claim that the press is rife with activists rather than journalists. And why does that matter so much?
Well, I suspect it's true that the press has always had a lot of people who were expressing a particular worldview. But I think we've got to the point now where factual reporting that is uh, necessary for people to attempt to make their own sense of what's going on is very, very difficult to find. You're not going to get a genuinely factual breakdown unless, you go to a very small number of people who are non-political and just talk about what they believe based on their experience of life and so on. And I just published on my Substack a piece from a friend of mine who works in the city, who we've called the anonymous banker. And that's because he doesn't want to be in the public eye. He just wants to say what he sees. And the reason that I really appreciate his analysis is he's not political, because he actually looks at what are the markets doing and why. What is the financial situation from a markets perspective, or from a finance perspective, or from an economics perspective. Whereas if you pick up a newspaper nowadays, most of the commentary, even about, things like economics or about things like energy, they are explicitly coaxed in all of this political language and political side taking. And that means that we're not looking at these issues with any clarity. And those are serious issues, but it also happens on all the other stuff we've talked about. It's very common now for people writing for the major publications or presenting things on major publications to be just completely misrepresentative of what is going on. I mean, for example, we talked about Rishi Sunak just now. I saw a clip from American, well, he's South African, but he's in America on the Daily Show, a comedian called Trevor Noah. And he does this 8-minute virtue signaling bit where he breaks down the backlash against Rishi Sunak's being prime minister. And I'm sitting here in the UK going, there is no backlash, mate. No one's going, oh my God, we've got an Indian descended prime minister. No one cares. We care about the fact that the country's screwed. And it doesn't matter what the guy in charge of it looks like. It's still going to be screwed because we've borrowed too much money. We haven't produced our own energy and whatever. No one cares. But he can go and do that, and he's taken seriously because it appeals to people's predilections and pre-existing biases about the world. And so millions of Americans can watch Trevor Noah talking about something that they do not know about, and they will take his word for granted because he's not a comedian anymore and he's not a journalist. What he is an activist.
I feel like you're just complaining that the media is getting onto your turf as a comedian, because it's a lot more entertaining to have these two sides. You can laugh at Fox News and you can laugh at The Guardian. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's sort of happened that in starting Triggernometry, my YouTube show with Francis Foster, we've kind of, I don't do stand up anymore because the lifestyle was absolutely killing me, and I've really lent more into the social commentary and the journalism, and so I'm thinking about that from that perspective. Yeah, for a comedian, of course, it's great. You've got two idiot parties on both sides, and you can mock them and make fun of them. But I also kind of think that we are in a position right now where we genuinely face some real problems, very serious problems. And, when we do our live streams and we just mock and satirize what's going on, that's all very well. And I enjoy that. But from a more journalistic perspective and a more cultural perspective, I'm also keen to actually get people to focus on what I think are the problems that actually matter. and economics, energy, defense policy. These are all things where, like, when times are good, you can afford to take your eye off the ball. The world is not going to be going through good times for the foreseeable future. It's going to be going through some very difficult times. And that's where we kind of need to wake up and start taking things seriously.
This relates really closely to the fifth point, which is the truth is a lie. You can question the most basic facts, and that's perfectly acceptable. It's all about how you feel rather than the objective truth. I remember reading about how people in the Soviet Union, the smartest people tended to study physics and maths because it was not political. And yet everything is political in this new Western worldview that you're railing against. And the truth is a lie. The simple facts can be not just they can be denied.
Mm. Well, not only denied, but they can be presented as hateful, as I joked earlier about hate facts. We have a lot of hate facts, the things that are true, but we're not allowed to say. So we, for example, have endless debates here in the UK about, politicians being like Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party. And by the way, Boris Johnson was only marginally better, being asked, what is a woman? And you get this sort of 3-minute stuttering monologue in response. And you're going, we've completely lost the plot, just completely. And there are so many other things about which you cannot speak bluntly. And I do think bluntly is the way we should be speaking about them, because they need solving. And pretending that being obfuscating about those issues is going to make the world better. It's just not true. So, we've got to remember that reality matters. But if you live on social media, as everyone now does, then reality doesn't matter at all, because I could take my phone out and tweet, "Gravity is not real," and as long as I'm sitting at home on the sofa with my phone, that's, to me, could be true. It just stops being real the moment I actually try and apply that in real life. And that's kind of, I think, where a lot of people are. They spend a lot of time in the world of ideas, or in the world of social media, or in the world of the mainstream media, and they're not actually out there in the real world going, does this correspond to reality? For example, we have a woman we have a trans woman called Karen White, who was a sexual offender, put in a prison with women who, surprise, committed sexual offenses against women. So the idea of social media and university conversation versus reality, that's where they start to clash. And so the truth does matter.
Yeah, I'm not going to go through all of those 10, but that's a great way to finish them. The fact that there's this truth that does matter. Let's move on to some of the more interesting aspects of this, because in the end, that was the tongue-in-cheek way to destroy the West. I think some of the other parts of the book make some real big claims, and there's some real epiphanies. But to sum it up, I think the easiest way is to say that the West is best. It's not perfect, it is best. And it saved you personally from a really bad fate. So why don't you give us your background, which is one of the reasons you've gotten away with writing this book, right?
Yeah, quite. Well, I was born in the Soviet Union in the early 80s. And my family were extremely poor at the time. And by the mid 80s, my grandfather, he criticized the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And that was like, saying trans women aren't women or whatever nowadays. It was just horrific. And he was basically cancelled the old school way, where the KGB came round to his house, searched it. He was fired from his job. His wife was fired from her job, and my father and his sister were kicked out of university. So that had happened. And then, quite fortunately, I suppose, for my family in some ways, the Soviet Union collapsed. And that was an opportunity where smart people like my dad could actually do quite well, while even though it was a very difficult time for many people. So we were quite wealthy for a short amount of time. And then for reasons that are too long to go into in this conversation, my family lost all the money that they had made. But in the intervening period, they were able to send me to boarding school in the UK when we had money, just for that short period of time. So that's how I ended up here. And of course, whether you look at what my ancestors had to go through in the Soviet Union. Many of my family were in the gulags or starved to death in the Holodomor or died in World War II, etc. Or whether you look at what's happening in Russia today. These are all things that are worth avoiding. And it seems to me that quite a good way of avoiding them is being in a country that is a liberal democracy that believes in capitalism, and that actually, as we talked about earlier, has the aspiration towards individual human rights and all of these things. So and by the way, there are people who have a different mindset to me, including here in the West. There are people who have a much more collectivist outlook. They don't want to be free. They don't want to have to make their own life. They want the government to look after them and to take care of them. And perhaps they should explore emigrating to China, because that way of looking at things is not the Western way. It is not what our societies are built on. They're built on allowing and unleashing human creativity, human potential, human talent, instead of constraining it and forcing the government apparatchiks to decide what you should research and what you should think and what you should be
This is
able
a
to
classic
say.
example of why your background makes this whole thing work so well. Because if somebody else said, these socialists and communists in the West, they should just go to China or they should just go to Venezuela, it's sort of a throwaway line, right? But when you're about 13, your kids, your parents did that to you. They sent you to the West, to a boarding school, to the misogynist and terrible capitalist West. And so it actually happened to you, and you do have that opinion from a very real place as a result. And on behalf of the British people, I want to apologize for all the terrible things that happened to you in the West.
Thank you very much. Gratefully accepted. Reparations now. But yeah, so I just I don't have any problem saying it, and I'm not saying it in any sort of aggressive way. I just think if you like living in a society with a social credit system, then why don't you move to China? But please do not bring non-Western, hostile, foreign ways of doing business to the West. I came to the West not to turn the West Russian. I came to the West and I went, well, this is my home now. I have to adapt to the local values and customs and become as British as I can be. And I'll never be fully British and probably never be fully Russian anymore. I'm kind of a mixture of the two, and I like it. But my point is, I'm not here to impose my own values on the society to which I've come. My job, first of all, was I didn't speak any English when I came to this country when I was 13 years old. Learn the language, understand how people think, understand how people behave, what people say, what people don't say in certain situations, and conduct myself in line with that. That is the job of an immigrant, in my opinion, is to integrate into the society. And it's one of the things I'm most proud of, that I now host a YouTube show which employs British people and other people, actually people all over the world now, to work. So, I've come and I've made the most of the opportunities. And I encourage anybody really to do that, whether they've come here or not. It's like the West is a place that is uniquely suited to allow you to fulfill in your potential. In most other parts of the world, including wealthy countries, the opportunities are very heavily restricted by who you know, what family you were born into, which part of the country you were born in. And the West is, look, it's not perfect. We have problems with social mobility, and I talk about it in the book, as you know. But the reality is there are very few places in the world where you can actually make something of yourself if you work hard, if you're talented. Yes, if you're fortunate too. But so just take advantage of it, make the most of it. If you have an idea, go for it. If you want to start a business, go for it. That, I think, is the right attitude for people in the West, because that is what our society is built on.
I want to get a bit more flavor of what it was like to grow up in the Soviet Union as a kid. And the best way to do that, you give lots of great details. And some of them are obviously really harrowing. And I don't think I can even relate to them despite having read them. But the best one was the Pavlik Morozov story about dobbing in your parents to the state. I don't know if you're a fan of Philip Pullman's books, but he uses almost exactly the same story in one of his recent fiction novels. So it really struck a chord with me that he probably got it from somewhere that was very real.
I haven't read that book, but yeah, of course. And the story of Pavlik Morozov, it's very well known. I think Jordan Peterson mentioned it in the past, but this was something that was very real in my childhood. And this was essentially the state teaching children to betray their parents in order to protect communism. And that is the level of ideological indoctrination where people are starting to rupture familial and other sort of connections over ideology and over politics. And that's not that dissimilar to the sort of things that we get up to now in this country, where having the wrong opinion or having a different view of things means that your friends will stop being friends with you. This is quite an unpleasant way of doing things, and I think it's largely a product of social media. Whereas in the Soviet Union, it was obviously a product of the state's power over the individual citizen.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning just quickly there that there was more people arrested in the UK for things they wrote on social media than in Russia, right? So one of the
that was
fun
true
stats
until the war. That was true until
That's
the
right.
war. That's changed quite a lot. People in Russia now get arrested for saying that they believe in peace, or in fact, what happened was initially people started going out into the street with placards which said "I'm for peace," and then they got arrested. So people would then go out with no placard; they would just hold their hands up with an imaginary sign, and they would still get arrested. So, and things have changed, unfortunately. But yes, prior to the invasion of Ukraine, the the numbers were not good for the UK. We arrest several thousand people every year for things that they say on social media, including opinions about gender identity, gender ideology, and things of that nature, making offensive jokes, etc. It's really unhealthy. I think really unhealthy.
It's considered quite inappropriate to say that you're in favor of peace in the West as well, though, on social media. It might not get you arrested, but still get in trouble. Let's move on, excuse me, to what I think is the real debate about ideology here. You mentioned before that there's some people who are very collectivist. They don't want to be free and independent. I think that's a bit of a misnomer, because we've got families. We're pretty collectivist within our families. There's lots of people who want to be in collectivist societies. To me, the issue is purely about whether you're allowed to force that collectivism or individualism on others using the government. So there's lots of contexts where I'm collectivist, lots of contexts where I'm a very individualist. But I don't feel like I should be forcing either of those models onto anyone else, and certainly not resorting to government power, the power of the law, to do that. And to me, that is where the debate lies right now. And it's why free speech, for example, has become a right-wing issue, a right-wing position, because it's not just about free speech. It's about the fact that the left is forcing its position using the law on other people, which is a much higher sort of threshold than just saying collectivist or individualist.
Yeah, but I think I haven't done the surveys, but I'd imagine collectivist people are more likely to feel that they're entitled to use the government to force their ideas on everybody else. And in the UK, we have in particular this sort of, it strikes me as very odd that we spend almost all of our time talking about how to carve up the pie, to use that metaphor that people hate, right? And we spend very little time talking about why don't we bake more pies, and then we don't have to squabble over this one. There is this sort of we've kind of forgotten that prosperity is not a product of taking things away from other people in society. Prosperity is generated by creating things, by building businesses, by hiring people. And I just, one of the things I rail against so much, because with Triggernometry now, essentially a small business, we employ several people. I can see in real time how the government taxing businesses, regulating businesses, etc., means that I can't hire as many people as I would like. I would like to hire more people, but I am giving away their salary and tax right now as a business that really isn't contributing a huge amount to the economy because we don't pay a huge amount of tax. But I'm being prevented from giving two people meaningful employment and a salary who otherwise probably don't have a job, right? And so I just think we've got it completely the wrong way around. We've forgotten what the idea of the market actually is. The idea of the market is that we generate things, we are productive, and we sort of talk about productivity as like item number 17 on the list of what's important. I kind of think it's like right towards the top. We need to create and build and generate. And part of that is, I'm afraid, you have to produce your own energy.
Yeah, the results though are quite similar from the West's approach and the Soviets' approach, because there's, as you wrote in the book, there's lots of involuntary vegans in the Soviet Union. Modern day comforts were out of reach for a lot of people. You couldn't heat your own house properly. All of these things are playing out in the West now. So we've ended up in the same place, it seems to me.
No, we haven't ended up in the same place at all. Let's not get carried away. The Soviet Union was incredibly poor. The Soviet Union was incredibly murderous in many ways, and what it took to get to that place was a lot of violence as well. So no,
Free
we haven't.
childcare, free healthcare. It sounds pretty good to me, Konstantin.
Well, and you haven't had free healthcare properly free healthcare and free childcare. That's why, because this is the problem again we face in the UK. Is like you can pursue the idea of free healthcare at the point of use, but eventually it bloats so much you just can't afford it in the way that it's configured. And in the Soviet Union, it's true, you had universal healthcare. It was also universally very, very bad. Right. So look, I'm not against some degree of redistribution and social safety net, and those are wonderful. I just think we also got to remember that business people are not the enemy, entrepreneurs are not evil. The fact that somebody has wealth doesn't make them the worst. But Rishi Sunak, actually, if you want to talk about the backlash against Rishi Sunak, the one thing that everyone seemed to me to be banging on about is that he's wealthy, and I'm like, well, so what? I don't care if he's wealthy. I care if he's going to do a good job of whatever he's going to do. And he's probably not, right? And that's fine. You can be annoyed with him about that. Why do we have to? This is a particularly British thing. And I hope that as someone who's British, I'm allowed to say this also. It's like there is this tall poppy syndrome where people who are successful, people who are who've made a lot of money are treated as suspect somehow. I don't think that's a healthy thing for a society to have. And so if there's one criticism I would make, it's that I think we need to have a much more forward-looking approach to business.
It's the same here in Australia with tall poppy syndrome. In fact, I'd say it's worse, and it's quite amusing, the extent to which it reaches. And there's a big debate at the moment about a mining company that funded the netball in Australia, and some people took issue with the fact that it's a mining company and turned into a big drama. I actually did have an experience with completely free healthcare in Romania, and let's just say there was a bribe involved, so it wasn't free in the end. So let's move on to education, because I'm really curious, given your experience of the Russian one and the UK one, adjusted for how the education system is working now, do you think that the Russian education system is wildly different to the indoctrination that kids are getting in the UK?
It is now. So kids are being lined up in photo shoots with the Z sign and all of that. So, then they're being taught a very crazy version of World War II history and so on. I'm sure that there's indoctrination that happens in school, but I think a lot of it isn't actually indoctrination. It's more just that we're not teaching them properly. So I was in Liverpool a few days ago, and I went to the Slavery Museum. And slavery is an issue, as you know, I talk about in the book in chapter 3. And I went around the museum, and there was some interesting stuff there, but the way it was presented, you never would have known that slavery had happened anywhere else, and you never would have known who the colonial slave traders were buying the slaves from. And you never would have known about the trans-Saharan slave trade, which was happening for a longer period of time and which was much worse. So it's not like kids are being brainwashed into like, this is how you must think. They're just not being given the information they need to have a complex picture of the world. It's very one-dimensional. And I think that is much more what's happening. Now, there are areas from when I speak to people who are in the education sector where perhaps some stuff around gender identity and gender ideology that is being spread, particularly in America and the UK, into schools, and that is a real worry to me because that shouldn't be happening. But more broadly, I just think we're teaching children very, very poorly, particularly about things like history, which matter a lot.
One of the things that fascinated me right through the book is how publicly declaring how deluded you are is a sign of commitment to the cause and therefore a laudable thing. and this goes like that woman question, what's woman, and things like that. That there's this, that, the more ridiculous you are, the better you are in today's society. Where's that going?
Nowhere good, I think, and that's why someone's at some point is going to have to sit down and go, how do we make social media healthier? Because that's where that comes from. Uh, you see it in Parliament, even the way that these debates are now being had. These people are no longer attempting to have a debate; they're trying to get a clip viral on Twitter, and that means they talk differently to each other, and they don't talk to each other; they talk at each other. And then the media pick up on that, and so they start to talk about things in that way. Social media, YouTube, everywhere, we're all locked into this way of doing things. It's not healthy, and we're going to have to work out. Social media is a hugely disruptive technology. I mean, the internet more broadly is a hugely disruptive technology, but social media in particular. And that means that it's going to take 10, 15, 20 years for us to adjust and work out, this crazy things come along. It's made everybody a bit mental. How do we get through this? What would be a more healthy version of social media that we would still enjoy using? I think that's probably how this gets fixed.
You're not really labeled left or right. You voted Remain in a referendum, but I think you're one of the rare people who treated Brexiteers very fairly and really advocated for how they were misrepresented. But I want to ask why the left wing has, as far as I can tell, a monopoly on, if it offends me, it can't be said. The left doesn't get censored for saying exactly the same thing as the right wing. If the left denies a simple fact on social media or in politics, whatever it might be, they don't get cancelled. It's very much one way traffic, it seems to me. That seems to be leading something pretty bad too.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that where you're probably on the right, I'm imagining, and therefore what you see through your own echo chamber of reality, that's how it would look. There are people on the left who get cancelled as well for doing and saying certain things.
For expressing right-wing views, I suspect.
Some of them, but some of them also not. There are people who get cancelled for upsetting right-wing snowflakes, if you like, and that can happen as well. But you're right, it doesn't happen nearly as often, and that's partly because I think the right is less snowflakey in the current incarnation. 20, 30 years ago, my great comedy heroes like Bill Hicks and George Carlin, they were railing against the right-wing Christian snowflakery that said you can't make jokes about religion and you can't say offensive words on TV and whatever. So the snowflakery moves from side to side over time. And we happen to be in a time where the left has cultural dominance and dominance of most of the institutions. So they're the ones that are going to be using that power unfairly, which is why I'm someone who's neither left or right, because whoever is the snowflake of the flavor of the day, I'm always going, let's have a level playing field and let's not destroy each other for having the wrong opinions. Let's have conversations between left and right. And I think the reason, for the thing that you're saying is the left has cultural power right now, much more so than the right.
I'm deeply offended that you called me right wing, by the way. Deeply offended. We're not going to publish this now. Immigration is a big theme, obviously, because of your background. It makes it a lot more rich. I'm actually a lot more in favor of higher levels of immigration, a lot more open borders than you are. So I'm not right wing as you think. But explain to me why an immigrant can be. You're not anti-immigrant, but I'm going to say it anyway. How can an immigrant be anti-immigrant?
Well, I am definitely not anti-immigrant, and this is why this conversation is so silly to me. First of all, the idea that countries should have borders has been uncontroversial through the entirety of human history. And it's only in the last 10 years that it seems to have become a big deal that, people genuinely talk about open borders, the most insane idea that you could possibly come up with. I am very pro-immigration when that immigration is good for the society into which the people are coming. And that means the society is relatively stable. It is able to integrate those people. It has houses for them to live in. It has jobs for them to do. And it is able to choose who comes and on what conditions, so that those people are genuinely likely to contribute to the society to which they come in. The way I think about immigration is like I think about ice cream. I like ice cream, I just don't want it every day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the rest of my life. Right. And in the UK, when I came to the UK in 1995, 3% of the British public thought that immigration was a major issue. And that's because immigration was not a major issue. And then we had the Blair government, during which more people came into Britain as immigrants than had come into Britain between 1066 and the Battle of Hastings and 1950. So more people came in 10 years than had come in a millennium. You can't pretend that isn't going, even if you're massively pro-immigration, you can't pretend that that's not going to be hugely impactful on the country. And that is not a criticism of the people who came. Most of them came to do jobs and to work hard and whatever. But I don't necessarily think it's moral, by the way, if you want to talk about this issue in terms of morality, as the left often do. I don't think it's moral to import Romanian and Bulgarian doctors to work packing our food in factories or to work in our restaurants. That's not really necessarily the fairest thing to do, because we're depriving those countries of their brightest minds who would be there looking after their people as doctors and nurses and so on. So there are a lot of different ways to slice it, but the basic principle of it is, I think, some immigration is very, very good, as we talked about earlier. We need dynamism. We need fresh blood every now and again. We need new ideas, and immigrants tend to be the most driven, the most risk-taking people in their society. That's what they're willing to move. They're often very bright, etc. I think we need them, and I think it's good to do that. I also don't think that just opening the door to anyone who wants to come in unlimited numbers, empirically, does not seem to be a good idea.
I had a miserable time with the UK's immigration system for my wife, vaguely similar to your experience for yourself. How do you think the immigration debate would change in the UK if everyone had to apply for citizenship and had to experience the trauma of the British immigration system?
I don't know. I've never thought about that. Look, the interesting thing is that I once had to apply for Russian citizenship, even though I'm Russian, for reasons that would take too long to explain. And so, I've seen what that's like elsewhere. I mean, I don't believe there's an immigration system that's pleasant in any country in the world. It's just is how it is. I don't think you're ever going to get to a point where it's anything other than that.
One of the best parts of the book for me was the rundown of everything that's happened since 2016 and the way you frame it. And what you basically say is, imagine you're an ordinary person who's not particularly politically interested or active, isn't really left or right. You're dropped into 2016, and a whole bunch of things happen that aren't supposed to. So they tell you Brexit's not going to happen. It does happen. They tell you it's going to be a disaster. It isn't. They tell you Hillary Clinton will win. Trump wins. It's going to be a big disaster if Trump wins. Doesn't happen. And you sort of give quite a long list with just the right amount of detail. And you sort of ask at the end of it, how is the average person going to feel after what they've just been through since 2016? Because, I mean, you'd be mad not to be mad. And you've referred to it as gaslighting, which is something that I've used in similar debates and discussions. So that was reason enough to buy the book, as far as I'm concerned, because it's so well done. Do you have any comments about what's happened since you published the book, whether it's gotten even worse?
Has it got worse? I just think it's continued to be as bad as it has been. I don't think the mainstream media have quite realized the impact that their misrepresentation of reality is having on the world. They exaggerate all this stuff to get clicks. What they don't understand, it was like people. I remember arguing with people at the time. Do you remember the Jordan Peterson, Kathy Newman interview?
Yeah, I didn't at the time, but I've seen it since, and all the memes that have come up since that were very enjoyable.
It went super viral.
Social media.
And I was saying, Channel 4, the channel that hosted that conversation that employed Kathy Newman, they've made a huge mistake. And people were saying to me, well, what are you talking about? They got 20 million views on YouTube and they got lots of clicks and whatever. And I was like going, yes, except nobody who watched that interview who's sensible is ever going to watch an interview with Kathy Newman ever again. And I haven't. It's been however many years. I haven't, and most people haven't. If you continually discredit yourself in the eyes of the public, they are going to switch off. They're going to find other places to go for their information. And that, by the way, has its negative sides as well, because you see how whether it's the issue of the vaccines that I talk about in the book, whether it's the issue of the Russia's invasion, whatever issue, there are people who go off the deep end in both directions on both of those issues and become very conspiratorial. And that's because, as I sort of say somewhat offensively, but I think accurately, the brains have been broken by this feeling of like, well, I can't trust anything anymore. Therefore, anything that someone says that sounds remotely true must be true. And so yeah, and so we've got to a position where quite a lot of people don't believe that there's reality anymore because they don't know what to believe that they read or see or whatever. And I think that's been one of the most unhealthy impacts of the mainstream media's misrepresentation of reality over such a long period of time.
You highlight a lot, and often in the book, that the business of outrage has become a commercial enterprise, and I think that's highlighted in your comment just then as well. But that's going to be downright dangerous over time, isn't it? Because the incentives then to make everything look even worse than it really is.
It is. I also think that even in my space and YouTube and what I do, obviously clickbait exists. And obviously, when you're choosing how to title an interview that you're putting out, you're thinking about making sure it grabs people's attention. But I also feel that that process itself produces the reaction that we need, which is I don't want to be putting out clickbait stuff very often. I don't want to be part of this exaggeration for outrage to get attention economy. I want to create substantive content for people to enjoy. And there are enough people who want that, maybe it's true that if I was to go super outrage clickbait or whatever, I could get way more views and listens than I do at the moment. But I don't care about that. I care about making a healthy contribution to the conversation. And so as long as there's enough of an audience for what I'm doing, that's what I'll keep doing. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that, yes, we've spent, 4 or 5 years going, yes, the wokeness is bad and that it's not helpful. And here's the flaws of it, and picking it apart and breaking it down and going whatever. In the process, some people have become equally deranged in the opposite direction. The process changes you. But quite a lot of us have got to a point where we're like, well, what would be a healthy way of having this discussion? What should we actually focus on that's going to be good? And that's why I talk so much about entrepreneurship, about energy production, about all these things, because I think these more technical solutions hold a lot of the answers to the cultural stuff, because solving the housing crisis, for example, would help massively to deal with the issue of wokeness. Because as we talked about earlier, if you have kids and if you have families, it forces you to grow up. And one of the reasons people aren't doing that is they can't afford to pair up and buy a place to live in. So, I think, yes, all of this division and clickbaity stuff has become a problem. I also think it will produce the solution that we're looking for in and of itself.
You encourage us to sort of engage and make our own battles in these issues that you talk about in the book. Isn't it too dangerous and not worth the effort?
I think it depends how you look at it. If you want to look at it on a short-term basis of your personal life right now, and do you want to upset people? Do you want to lose friends? Do you want to whatever? Then maybe not. But if you want your children to have a healthy society to live in, if you want your country to spend enough on defense that it defends itself from hostile enemies, if you want your country to be economically prosperous so that you have a job not only today but 10 years from now, then it seems to me like a good investment.
And the best way to do it is to buy the book, An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. Thanks very much for joining us, Konstantin Kisin.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.